Look around you, and you'll notice something that doesn't add up. Some people walk through 50, 60, 70 years of life and somehow look lighter than people half their age. No surgery, no filters, no secret skincare line. And here's the uncomfortable part. Many of these people didn't have easy lives. Some of them lost everything. Some of them survived things that would break most of us completely. So if hardship is supposed to age a person, why are the ones who suffered the most often the ones who look the least worn down by time? Carl Jung spent decades trying to answer exactly that question, and what he found wasn't about genetics, luck, or lifestyle. It went much deeper, into the psyche itself, into what happens to everything a person refuses to feel, refuses to express, refuses to let go of. He discovered that aging isn't simply a matter of years passing. It's a matter of what gets buried along the way. And that single idea changes everything about how you'll look at the people around you from this point forward. The ones who seem to glow with an energy that has nothing to do with their birth certificate, and the ones who, despite having every advantage, look quietly exhausted by a life they haven't even finished living yet. What you're about to learn isn't a wellness trend. It's not something you'll find in a skincare aisle or a fitness app. It's something Jung uncovered in session after session, watching real people carry real pain, and watching some of them transform that pain into something that made them look more alive, not less. By the end of this, you'll understand exactly why some faces age and others seem to soften with time, and more importantly, you'll understand which one you're currently becoming, and what, if anything, you might want to change about that starting today. Somewhere in your life, you've met this person. Maybe it was a teacher, a neighbor, someone at a family gathering, and when you found out their real age, you genuinely didn't believe it. Not because they'd had cosmetic work done, not because they dressed younger or followed some elaborate skincare routine. There was no vanity in it, no performance. It was something quieter, something that seemed to radiate from underneath the skin rather than sit on top of it. That small jolt of disbelief, the gap between the number and the face in front of you, it doesn't come from lighting or genetics alone. It comes from something that doesn't fit neatly into the categories most people use to explain why a face looks the way it looks. Carl Jung noticed this pattern decades before wellness culture turned aging into a trend to chase. He wasn't looking at it as a cosmetic curiosity. He was a clinician, a man who spent his life observing the psyche up close, session after session, decade after decade. And what he kept noticing didn't line up with the obvious explanations. These weren't always the people with the easiest lives. They weren't always the wealthiest, the most rested, the most protected from hardship. In fact, often the opposite was true. Jung began to suspect that something deeper than biology was at play, something connected to how a person related to their own inner world, not how many vegetables they ate or how many hours they slept. This wasn't genetics handing out a lucky card. It was something happening internally, almost invisible to the eye until you knew what you were looking for. Think about the people in your own life who carry this quality. Maybe it's a mentor who, despite being well into their 60s, has this lightness to their face, an ease in the way they hold themselves. Maybe it's someone who's been through enormous loss, and yet there's no bitterness etched into their features the way you'd expect. This is the detail that makes the whole thing strange enough to pull you in. It doesn't behave like normal aging. Normal aging is supposed to be linear, predictable, written into the genes and confirmed by the calendar. But this phenomenon breaks the pattern. It suggests that whatever is happening on the surface of a person's face is being shaped by something underneath that most people never learn to look at, let alone work with consciously. So here's the question worth sitting with for a moment, because it's the question that opens everything else. If it isn't genetics, and it isn't simply lifestyle, What is it? What allows one person to move through 50, 60, 70 years of living and come out the other side looking lighter than they did a decade before, while another person, technically younger, looks worn down by a life that from the outside seemed easier? Jung spent a great deal of his work trying to answer exactly this. And the answer, once you see it, changes the way you understand not just aging, but the entire relationship between the mind and the body. But to get there, there's a deeper paradox that needs to be looked at first, one that seems to contradict everything you'd expect about suffering and the toll it takes. If you actually dig into the lives of these people, the ones who seem to defy the calendar, you don't find an absence of pain. You find the opposite. You find loss that would break most people, betrayals that cut deep, crises that should have left permanent scars on the face and in the posture. This is where the story stops making sense, at least on the surface. These aren't people who floated through life untouched. Many of them buried parents young, went through divorces that gutted them, lost careers, lost friendships, lost entire chapters of who they thought they were. And yet, here they are, decades later, looking lighter than people who, by comparison, had relatively gentle lives. This is the detail that should stop you in your tracks, because it contradicts almost everything we're taught to believe about suffering. We grow up assuming that hardship leaves a mark, that grief ages you, that stress carves lines into your face, that trauma settles into the body and stays there permanently, visible to anyone who looks closely enough. There's truth in that assumption, of course. You can see it in people who've been through difficult things and seem to carry the weight of it physically, in their shoulders, in their eyes. So when you meet someone who's been through just as much, sometimes more, and they don't carry that same weight, it forces a question that's almost uncomfortable to sit with. If suffering is supposed to age us, why does it skip some people entirely? Consider two people who lived through nearly identical losses. Say both lost a spouse around the same age. Both had to rebuild a life they didn't choose to rebuild. Years later, one looks hardened, guarded, older than their years. The other looks soft around the eyes, present, somehow more alive than before the loss happened. Same category of event. Wildly different outcomes. This is the kind of comparison that should make you pause, because if the event itself caused the aging, both people should look roughly the same. They don't. Which means the event was never the variable that mattered most. Something else was happening in between the loss and the way it eventually showed up on each person's face, something that had nothing to do with the magnitude of what they went through. And this is the question that opens the entire rest of this story, the one Jung spent a lifetime circling. If it's not the difficulty itself that ages a person, then what is it? Why do two people walk through the same fire and come out looking like they aged at completely different speeds? The answer isn't found in the event. It's found in what happens after the event, in how a person relates to what they're carrying, long after the world has moved on and stopped paying attention. And that answer reaches all the way down into how the mind processes experience itself, which is exactly where the next piece of this puzzle begins. Here's where Jung's thinking takes a turn that most people never expect. He didn't believe time itself was the thing doing the damage. Time passes for everyone at exactly the same rate. A year is a year, whether you spend it in peace or in turmoil. So if time were the only factor, aging would look identical across the board, give or take genetics. But it doesn't, which means something else is doing the heavy lifting, something that has nothing to do with the clock on the wall and everything to do with what's happening underneath it. What Jung pointed to instead was accumulation, not the years themselves, but everything stacked inside those years that never got released, every emotion pushed down, every grief postponed, every anger swallowed because expressing it felt too dangerous or too inconvenient at the time. Picture it almost like sediment settling at the bottom of a riverbed, layer after layer, year after year, until the water above looks calm, but the riverbed underneath has become dense, heavy, almost solid. That's what he meant by psychological sedimentation, and it's a strange thing to sit with, because it suggests that what shows up on your face later in life isn't really about how old you are. It's about how much you've been carrying without ever setting it down. This reframes the entire conversation around aging. If you've ever noticed someone who seems to be in a constant state of bracing, shoulders slightly raised, jaw tight, a kind of permanent low-grade tension behind their eyes, you're looking at someone carrying sediment. They may not even know it. Most people don't. They assume the tension is just how they are, a personality trait rather than the residue of years of unprocessed experience. And on the other side of that, you'll find people who've clearly lived hard lives, and yet there's a softness to them, an openness in the face, as if very little is being held back or guarded against. The difference between these two people was never about how much happened to them. It was about how much of it got metabolized versus how much got buried. This is the idea worth holding on to as the next layer of this gets uncovered. Because sedimentation doesn't happen randomly. It has a very specific source. A very specific mechanism by which the mind decides what gets felt and processed versus what gets pushed down and stored away. And that mechanism has a name. Jung called it the shadow, and understanding what it actually is and what it costs the body to keep it buried changes everything about how you'll see the people around you from this point forward. The shadow is one of those ideas that sounds abstract until you actually see it in your own life, and then it becomes impossible to ignore. Jung described it as everything in a person that gets rejected by the conscious mind in order to be acceptable, lovable, presentable to the world. Every emotion that felt too messy to show. Every desire that felt shameful. Every flash of anger, jealousy, neediness, or grief that got pushed down because somewhere along the way, someone, a parent, a teacher, a culture made it clear that this particular part of you wasn't welcome. So it didn't disappear. It went underground. And the shadow is simply the name for everything that's living down there, out of sight, but never actually gone. Here's the part that surprises most people the first time they really understand it. The shadow doesn't just sit quietly in some psychological basement, harmless and inert. It has weight, real physical weight. Think about the last time you suppressed something, bit your tongue in a conversation, swallowed an emotion you didn't feel safe expressing. Notice what happened in your body in that moment. Your jaw probably tightened. Your shoulders probably crept up toward your ears. Your breath probably got shorter, more shallow. That's not imagination. That's the nervous system physically bracing against something it's been told to suppress. Now multiply that moment by thousands, by tens of thousands, repeated over years and decades, and you start to understand how repression stops being a mental event and becomes a physical one. This is where cortisol enters the picture. The stress hormone that, in short bursts, helps you survive real danger, but when activated chronically, day after day, year after year, begins quietly wearing down the body. Chronic suppression keeps cortisol elevated in ways most people never connect to their inner emotional life. They feel the tight jaw and assume it's just stress from work. They feel the curved shoulders and assume it's just bad posture from sitting at a desk too long. They never trace it back to the actual source, years of compressed shadow material, sitting in the body because it was never given anywhere else to go. This is the invisible cost of trying to be presentable all the time, a quiet, slow-burning tax paid by the nervous system for every piece of yourself that got rejected and buried instead of expressed. So here's what starts to come into focus. Maybe it was never the difficult events themselves that aged a person. Maybe it was everything they refused to feel about those events. The shadow material accumulating, compressing, demanding more and more energy just to stay hidden. And if that's true, it opens up an entirely different question, one that flips the usual story about resilience completely on its head. Because the people who seem to defy aging the most aren't the ones who avoided pain. They're the ones who learned to do something very specific with it, something most people were never taught, and something that changes everything about how suffering moves through a body instead of settling permanently inside it. This is the turn in the story that changes everything you thought you understood about resilience. It isn't the hardship that ages a person. It's the resistance to the hardship, the years spent fighting against what already happened, refusing to let it be real, refusing to feel the full weight of it because feeling it seemed unbearable. Two people can go through the exact same loss. One spends years resisting it, pushing it down, distracting from it, pretending it didn't change them, and that resistance becomes the sediment, the shadow material, the cortisol spike that never fully resolves. The other person, somehow, does something different. They don't avoid the pain. They don't get swallowed by it either. They simply let themselves feel it, fully, without performing strength or rushing the process. This is the part most people get wrong about awakened, lighter, younger-looking individuals. They didn't get lucky and avoid suffering. Look closely at their actual histories and you'll usually find just as much hardship as anyone else, sometimes more. What separates them isn't the absence of pain. It's that somewhere along the way, often through a crisis severe enough to force the issue, they learned to stop managing their emotions and started actually feeling them. Managing emotion means controlling it, containing it, performing composure while something painful sits untouched underneath. Feeling emotion means letting it move through you completely. Grief that's allowed to be grief. Anger that's allowed to be anger, without judgment attached to having it in the first place. Think of someone you know, who, after a major loss, didn't disappear into stoic silence and didn't fall apart and stay there either. They cried when it was time to cry. They got angry when anger was the honest response. And then, and this is the part that matters most, they came back. They didn't get stuck in the emotion, and they didn't bury it either. That ability to fully feel something without either suppressing it or being consumed by it is rare, and it's exactly the skill that separates people who age heavily under hardship from people who somehow seem to soften and lighten despite it. It's worth naming this explicitly, because most people have never been taught the difference. Managing an emotion is exhausting and depletes you over time. Feeling an emotion completely actually releases energy once it's done. What this means is that the real work was never about becoming someone who suffers less. It was about becoming someone who resists less. Someone who can meet whatever shows up internally without immediately trying to control it, fix it, or hide it from view. And that raises an uncomfortable question worth sitting with. How much of your own energy right now is going into managing a feeling instead of simply letting yourself have it? Because there's a particular mask most people wear to keep that management invisible to everyone around them. A mask so habitual most people forget they're even wearing it. And that mask comes with a cost of its own, one that's about to come into focus next. Jung gave a name to the mask almost everyone wears without realizing it: the persona. It's the version of yourself built for public consumption, the calm professional at work, the agreeable friend, the put-together parent, the person who always seems fine, because fine is what gets accepted, what gets approved of, what keeps the peace. The persona isn't inherently bad. Everyone needs some version of it to function in a world that requires a certain amount of social packaging. The problem isn't that the persona exists. The problem is what happens when the gap between the persona and the actual self, the real, messy, complicated person underneath, grows too wide for too long. Here's what most people never realize. Maintaining that gap is expensive, and the body is the one paying the bill. Think about what it actually takes to perform a version of yourself that doesn't match what you're feeling underneath. If you're exhausted but smiling, irritated but pleasant, breaking inside but composed on the outside, your nervous system is working overtime to keep that mismatch from showing. It's like holding a heavy door open with your shoulder for hours at a time. You can do it, but it costs something, continuously, even if you've gotten so used to the strain that you no longer notice it's there. This is where the micro-adjustments come in. The tiny, constant corrections most people make dozens of times a day without ever registering them consciously. The forced smile when you wanted to say no, the agreeable nod when you actually disagreed, the composed voice when your hands were shaking underneath the table. Each one of these is small, almost invisible on its own, but stacked across years, thousands of meetings, thousands of conversations, thousands of moments where the real self got quietly overridden by the persona. It adds up to a nervous system that's permanently activated, permanently bracing, permanently in a low simmer of stress that never fully shuts off. This is the kind of chronic activation that doesn't show up as a dramatic event. It shows up slowly, in the face, in the posture, in the eyes that look tired even after a full night's sleep. So here's the question that starts to take shape. What happens when someone finally stops performing? What happens to a person's energy, their face, their entire physiology, when the gap between the persona and the real self finally closes, when they stop managing the performance and start actually living as who they are underneath it? Because something does happen, something measurable, something visible, something that looks a lot like the very phenomenon this whole story started with, and it's worth seeing exactly what gets returned to a person once that performance is finally allowed to stop. Most people assume that healing is mostly about subtraction, letting go of pain, releasing old grief, dropping the weight that's been carried for years. And that's true, as far as it goes. But it's only half the picture. What actually happens when someone stops performing the persona and starts living from something more honest is just as much about addition as it is about release. Things come back. Qualities that went dormant decades ago, buried under the weight of trying to be acceptable, suddenly resurface, and they come back with a kind of energy that's impossible to fake. Sensitivity is usually the first thing to return. Not fragility, sensitivity. The capacity to actually feel something when you see it. To be moved by a piece of music or a stranger's kindness without immediately rationalizing the feeling away. People who've spent years in persona mode often describe themselves as numb, without realizing that's what's happening. They've gotten so good at managing emotion that they've lost touch with feeling much of anything. When that wall comes down, sensitivity rushes back in, and it often surprises the person how much they'd actually shut off without noticing. Creativity tends to follow right behind it, because creativity requires a willingness to make something imperfect, something that might be judged, something that doesn't fit the polished image the persona was built to maintain. And then there's something even more unexpected, healthy anger. Not rage, not bitterness, but the clean, clear kind of anger that says, this isn't okay, and then moves through the body and dissolves once it's been honored. Most people have spent so long suppressing this particular emotion, fearing it makes them difficult or unlikable, that its return often feels disorienting at first, almost unfamiliar, like rediscovering a muscle that hasn't been used in years. And here's the part that ties directly back to where this whole story began. All of this, the sensitivity, the creativity, the capacity for clean anger, comes with a biological signature. People who reclaim these dormant qualities don't just feel different, they look different. There's a visible shift in the face, a kind of openness that wasn't there before, an energy that reads as youthfulness, even though nothing about their actual age has changed. This is the part of the story where the physical and the psychological stop being separate conversations entirely, and to understand exactly how that connection works. The next piece worth looking at is how a person's relationship with time itself, past and future, plays directly into how worn down or how alive they end up looking. Most people don't actually live in the present moment, even though they think they do. They live scattered across two other places instead, an unresolved past that keeps replaying, and a feared future that hasn't even happened yet. Watch how often a conversation drifts towards something that went wrong years ago, still being relitigated as if it just happened yesterday. Watch how often worry shows up about something that may never even occur. This isn't a character flaw, it's an extremely common pattern, almost the default setting for the human mind when nothing has interrupted it. But it comes at a real cost, one that shows up in the body whether a person notices it or not. Here's why this matters so much for the conversation about aging. The nervous system doesn't know the difference between a threat that's happening right now and a threat that's being mentally rehearsed. When you replay an old wound, your body responds with the same stress chemistry as if the wound were happening again, in real time. When you rehearse a feared future, your body braces as if that future has already arrived. So someone who spends most of their waking hours moving between an unresolved past and an imagined future is essentially triggering their stress response dozens of times a day, every single day, for years. Even though nothing dangerous is actually happening in the room they're sitting in. This is exhausting in a way that's hard to measure because it's invisible. There's no single dramatic event to point to, no obvious villain. It's just a slow, repeated activation that wears down the body the same way water wears down stone, not through force, but through repetition. Compare this to someone who has built what Jung referred to as a stable center, a place inside themselves that isn't constantly being pulled backward into old wounds or forward into imagined disasters. This person still has a past, they still think about the future, but they're not living inside either one. They're anchored somewhere steadier, and that anchoring shows up physiologically as a nervous system that isn't perpetually bracing for impact. This stable center isn't some abstract spiritual luxury reserved for monks and mystics. It's closer to a skill, something built gradually through the willingness to actually feel what's present instead of escaping into rehearsal and rumination. And once you understand how much energy gets burned simply by living unanchored in time, a new question opens up. One about what it actually means to let an emotion complete itself instead of getting stuck halfway, replayed forever, or pushed down and frozen in place. Because that completion, it turns out, is where a tremendous amount of trapped energy gets released back to the person who's finally willing to let it happen. Every emotion by its nature has a shape, a beginning, a rise, a peak, and a natural point of completion. Grief moves like this. Anger moves like this. Even joy moves like this, though no one ever worries about joy getting stuck. The trouble starts when that natural arc gets interrupted, and there are really only two ways that interruption tends to happen. The first is suppression. The emotion starts to rise and gets shut down immediately, pushed underground before it ever gets to move through the body the way it was designed to. The second is the opposite extreme, getting completely swallowed by the emotion, pulled under by it, unable to find the shore again, stuck in the middle of the arc indefinitely instead of moving through it to the other side. Both of these, suppression and being consumed, leave the emotional arc unfinished. And an unfinished arc doesn't just disappear when you stop paying attention to it. It stays open, like a loop that never closed, quietly pulling on energy in the background for years, sometimes decades, long after the original event that triggered it is gone and mostly forgotten. This is part of what was meant earlier by sediment, by shadow material, by everything stacking up beneath the surface. An unfinished emotional arc is one of the heaviest things a person can carry, precisely because it was never resolved, only paused. Now picture the third option, the one that's far less common but available to everyone, letting the arc complete. This means feeling the rise without rushing it, staying present through the peak without numbing it or being destroyed by it, and then allowing the natural decline to happen on its own timeline rather than forcing it. Grief that's allowed to complete its arc eventually softens into something closer to peace, even tenderness, rather than staying sharp and raw indefinitely. Anger that's allowed to complete its arc burns clean and then genuinely passes, rather than calcifying into bitterness that colors everything for years afterward. This is rarely taught, rarely modeled, and it's exactly why so many people walk around with dozens of incomplete arcs stacked inside them without ever realizing it. Here's why this matters so much for everything discussed so far. A completed emotional arc releases the energy that was tied up inside it. That energy doesn't just evaporate, it becomes available again. Fuel that can be used for living instead of being spent maintaining a loop that never closed. This is one of the central, quiet reasons certain people seem to radiate more vitality than their years would suggest. They're not spending the bulk of their internal energy holding old loops shut. And once enough of those loops have been allowed to complete, something even bigger becomes possible. A way of living that isn't organized around managing the ego's image anymore, but around something far more stable and far more alive underneath it. Everything in this story has been building toward a single distinction, and it's the one Jung considered the most important of his entire body of work. The difference between living from the ego and living from what he called the self. The ego is the part of a person organized around image, around being seen a certain way, around performing a role that earns approval and avoids rejection. The self is something deeper, the authentic core of a person, the part that exists independently of whether anyone is watching or approving. Most people spend the majority of their lives operating almost entirely from the ego, without ever realizing there was another way to live. Because the ego's voice is loud, constant, and convincing. Living from the ego is exhausting precisely because it requires constant maintenance, managing how you're perceived, defending an image, performing a version of yourself that needs near constant upkeep. Living from the self requires something almost the opposite: less effort, less performance, less management. But it asks for a kind of honesty most people were never taught how to access. It means letting the persona be smaller and less central. It means feeling the shadow material instead of burying it. It means letting emotional arcs complete instead of freezing them halfway. Every single thing covered in this story has actually been pointing toward this one shift, piece by piece, layer by layer. And this is where the story comes full circle back to where it started. The face. The face was never just a cosmetic surface, something separate from the inner world and only loosely connected to it. The face is closer to a mirror, a physiological readout of exactly how much energy is being spent maintaining a performance versus how much is finally free to simply exist. Someone living predominantly from the ego carries that cost visibly, in tension, in tightness, in a kind of armor that shows up around the eyes and the jaw, whether they intend it to or not. Someone living from the self carries something else entirely, an ease that reads, to anyone looking, as vitality, as lightness, as something that doesn't quite match the number on their birth certificate. This was never a cosmetic secret hiding in some skincare routine or biohacking protocol. It's a biological truth, written directly onto the face by the way a person relates to their own inner world, by how much shadow they've metabolized instead of buried, how many emotional arcs they've allowed to complete instead of freezing in place, how much of their life is finally being lived from the self instead of performed by the ego. And once you see this pattern clearly, you start noticing it everywhere, in the people around you, and eventually, if you're willing to look closely enough, in the choices available to you in your own life, starting today. So here's the real question, the one that actually matters now that you've seen the whole picture. How much of your own life right now is being spent managing an image instead of actually living? How much energy goes, every single day, into holding a persona in place, staying composed when you're not, staying agreeable when you don't mean it, staying fine when you're anything but? And how much of what you're carrying right now, old grief, old anger, old wounds that never got to finish their arc, is quietly aging you in ways no mirror will show you until years from now, when it's already written permanently into your face? This isn't something you fix by trying harder to look younger. It's something you shift by getting honest with yourself first, before anyone else. What's one emotion you've been managing instead of actually feeling? What's one part of your shadow you've kept hidden because it felt safer that way? What would it look like, just for today, to let the persona soften a little and let something more real take its place? You don't need to overhaul your entire life to start. You need to notice one loop that never closed, and finally let it. If this resonated with you, if something in this video named a pattern you recognized in yourself or in someone you love, don't let it stop here. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and keep walking this path with us. Because this is only the beginning of understanding what it actually means to live from the self instead of performing for the world. The face you have 10 years from now is being shaped by the choices you make starting today. Make them count.